So several years ago, I was teaching Bible geography in the about to say geometry, that's what I teach in high school, in the junior high class. And Dan and I would share papers, information back and forth. And so last week when class was over, I'm walking down the hallway, tapped real quick on the shoulder and said, "Stephen, I'm out of town next week. Can you teach Bible geography class for me?" I said, "Okay," he said, "and I want you to teach specifically about Palestine. Don't teach the way that I've been doing where I'm talking about the history and the intertwining of the Bible stories with particular locations, but talk about the uniqueness like you did with the junior high class." I said I'd be glad to. So let's begin this journey. We go into the book of Deuteronomy. Moses has climbed up Mount Nebo, climbed up from the Jordan Valley. It's about 3,900 feet high. And it was there that God said, "You will not enter into the land of Canaan, but you'll get a chance to see it." And so in chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, it describes this event. Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Mount Pisgah, east of Jericho. And the Lord showed him the entire whole land, the territory of Gilead, as far north as the town of Dan, and the entire territory of Naphtali, the territories of Ephraim and Manasseh, the territory of Judah, as far west as the Great Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the southern part of Judah, and the plain that reaches from Zoar to Jericho. I now realize that color is not really good for the screen, but Mount Nebo is right there. And so from standing here, you could look all the way up to Dan, which is just a little bit higher here, could look across the Jordan Valley, could look to see the Mediterranean Sea, and could look all the way down here to the plains of Naphtali. And so it was there that he stood and he looked over the Jordan River. You can see that from here there is a rift. And the high part, which I will show later with the mountains when we get to that part, is Mount Hebron. And Mount Hebron feeds water that comes down through here, through this rift, and all the way down to what will be the Dead Sea, which we will spend specific time talking about that. But what I'd like to be able to do this morning is to talk about, first of all, the geography that you see. There's four main parts that you're looking at, and they all run north to south. You've got the Mediterranean coastal plain, and we'll delve into each one of these in just a moment. Then you have the part where most of the history that you hear about, the Judean hills, the highlands. This is the central portion, and it's broken up by this east and west running of the valley of Jezreel. Once again, that blue is not that best of colors, so I'm sorry about that. And then you have the Jordan Rift Valley running here, and that's what Moab is right on the verge of. And then you have this plateau, the eastern plateau known as the Transjordan. They all run north and south with the exception of the Jezreel Valley. So let's spend the time looking at this location, crossroads. It's a crossroads between Europe being to the north, up into here, gone over into Europe, that would be this way. The beginning of Asia, Asia Minor, which would then get us over into here, and then of course down into here, the African continent. So it was a crossroads, as you can envision, as you would cross through Europe, come down to Africa, or from the Asian area to come back over to avoid this spot. It's kind of hot. It's called a big desert, the Arabian Desert. You don't really want to go through there. So you go up above, as we were taught with the teachings that Dan was given about how coming out from Ur of the Chaldees and coming up along the Euphrates River and coming up to here and then coming down. That's the way most people would travel. So this was the crossroads. It's a fertile plain that you see along the Mediterranean Sea, very fertile, but at the times also swampy. This is where most of the agriculture is located here in the highlands, and then you have the wonderful location of the Jordan Valley. Very fertile location along that middle point. When you talk about Nebo, being at 3,900 feet, have you ever been to the Catskills in New York? Have you ever been to the Ozark Mountains? That's about the size of what Nebo is, the height of 3,900 feet. So first, the coastal plain, a relatively flat and sandy and fertile area right through here. It's broken up with the little bits of rivers, little streams that flow out from the hills that are running here in this backbone, if you want to think of it, this backbone, and it flows off to the west, and some little streams that come down towards the Mediterranean. It's very fertile, but it's flat and it's sandy. The Central Highlands, that's that backbone, that's that Mediterranean rise up to the backbone in western Palestine. It's made up of three locations: the upper portion, the Galilean Hills, Samaria is down in this portion, and then Judean hills that are located here. So you've got a plain that's going up, you've got the highlands that goes up, and then you've got these three major sections: Galilee, the Samaritan area, and the Judean area. You've got the Jordan Rift, as we talked about, and the Transjordan. Then there's three areas. Galilee, that's the northernmost point. It's known for its hills. It's very fertile in that area. The central portion, Samaria, it has very strong, significant biblical cities. It's flanked by two mountains, and we'll spend time in a while talking about the individual mountains. But Mount Carmel is right up here, and then down in the valley itself are two, well, there's where Mount Garrison is here, and Mount Ebal is across from it. The notable features: the Mediterranean Sea to the far west, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, which lies at the bottom of the Jordan River. It's the Earth's lowest point. And then the Jezreel Valley, a very significant, known for its proximity to Mount Carmel and the events that occurred there. Give you an idea about the size of it. Have you ever been to New Jersey? Well, if you have, you've been to about the same size as the land of Israel, the land of Palestine. The land of Palestine is approximately about 140, 185 miles wide, and in length, and the width is about 50 to 80 miles. To give you an idea of the state of Florida, from West Palm Beach to Orlando is about 171 miles. From West Palm Beach to Clewiston is around 70 miles. That's about the same measure, north and south, east and west, as it is for Palestine. New Jersey is approximately 170 miles long and about 70 miles wide. It's not a big area, broken apart by these four plains, these valleys, these hills, and the hills that are here, up from Dan down to Beersheba, which is down in this area. And that's what Moses saw when he was standing there. Let's talk a little more specifically about the individual areas. The coastal plain. It's a narrow strip along the Mediterranean Sea. It widens significantly as it moves down into the plains of Philistia. This is very skinny through here. It will get to be about 50 miles at the most down in through here. But it's a very tight, sandy location that was not really important as far as the people of the Bible that we read about, but there's a lot of folks that you know that occupied this area. Like you think about the Philistines. The area of Philistia controlled basically from right here, from Gaza to about Joppa. You know, when you read about the Philistines, you think they had a big area. They were big and mighty, and they were mighty, but they had a small area. It widens specifically as you get down to the southern portion, the plain of Sharon. That's that middle area. This is the trees. These are the trees that you would hear about, the forest area that begins right up here in this plain north of Caesarea, moving up to just north of the valley of Jezreel. Now, one of the things that's unique about this whole area along the Mediterranean, you'd think that Israel would have had a really big maritime influence, but they didn't because of the lack of natural harbors along this way. So there was not really an Israelite maritime trade. Instead, it was dominated by the Phoenicians, that occupied up in this area because of the ports. North of here is several ports that you would hear about. You're probably aware of this port right here. That one's the beginning of one. And with Joppa, you've heard of it, and something pertaining to one of the major stories of the Bible. So the coastal plain widens from about 10 to 20 miles in the southern portion. There's also identified the area that's north of Mount Carmel. It's about 25 miles long and 8 miles wide. So running from about here, Mount Carmel, about 25 miles north and about 8 miles to 10 miles through here. So it's not a really wide area along the plain. And then you've got the plain of the Philistines, which I said is from Joppa to Gaza, and the Phoenicians that controlled the northern part. Excuse me for a second. Let's move forward a little bit. Talking about the backbone, to give you an idea of what it looks like, you can see the coastal plain that runs through here. Much wider in through here, but you can see how it gets smaller as you then get up to where the Jezreel Valley begins, this valley cutting through here. And so you see the the backbone attitude of the hills of Judea running all the way up through Samaria, all the way up to this area north of Dan. And then here's the mountains that are feeding the Jordan River that begins to come down with the Sea of Galilee right here and this rift that runs all the way down to the Dead Sea. Now this rift runs all the way down, runs all the way out to the Red Sea. And then on the other side of the Jordan Rift is the Transjordan, which again are more hills, mountains. And we'll again get more specific about the mountains, but that's where you could refer to this being the backbone, as you can see with that spine running down through it. But look at the plains. So you can see this is sort of marshy. It wasn't really a strong area. And one of the things that created was when people would come in, that when the Philistines came, they had a long walk through some tiring, sandy, marshy areas. To then, if to try and go up towards Jerusalem, which is up in this area, they had to begin to climb up the hills. And it would be something that would tire them out at times because they had such a unique walk to get there. The central hill, that's the backbone. That's the mountainous spine, as I said. Those slopes, those rise from like 3,000 to about 33,000 feet. They have a significant amount of rainfall and very suitable for agriculture. But that also provided a natural defense. When you have Shechem, which was located about here, Jerusalem down in through here, because of the height, because of having to go up, because of the advantage that you could have from that height to see people that are coming, there was a natural sense of defense that was given, so it was a natural defensive advantage. Once again, the Jordan Rift. The Jordan Rift, and I'm talking about the valley itself, not the Jordan River, but this rift, this area of green. This Jordan Rift, it's a major depression that runs north and south and runs through that area. And the river flows from Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon is located right up here. And it's from the snows, you know, that always threw me too, when the Bible would talk about the snows, to think, because when you think about the desert, you think about the stories you hear. It's going to be hot and snow. It doesn't occur. But yet, this mountain has snow. And the melt of the snow, as well as about 3 major wadis or 3 major rivers or major streams that would flow out from here with the other hills, would flow down and become the beginning of the Jordan River, which would come down to this area known as Hula. That's marshy, then flows downward, literally downward in height, about 900 feet over a course of about 50 miles to come down to this area, which is very well known, the Sea of Galilee. And then it would continue from the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea. And of course, the Dead Sea has no continual outlet from there because that's the terminus of the river. The Sea of Galilee, it's a freshwater river. That's where Jesus performed many of his miracles. And the Dead Sea, it's a hypersaline sea, or lake, actually. It's the lowest point on Earth, on the Earth's surface. It's nearly 1,400 feet below sea level. Now, it's not the lowest place on Earth, of course. That's in the Pacific Ocean with, I think, the Mariana Trench. But it's called the Salt Sea in the Bible, and it was a background for a lot of the things that we've heard about with stories like with Abraham and his war and the situation involving Lot, with David and his flight from Saul and where he would go into some of the caves that existed right through here on this northern portion, northwestern portion of the Dead Sea. The limestone cliffs that are on this edge would be pocked with a lot of caves. There were a lot of bandits that were there, outlaws. It was a great place for political hideaways, sectarian religious groups that would hide into there. And so those caves that formed along the side of the Jordan River. The rift, it begins, as I said, up in Samaria. It goes to the Lebanese mountains, runs south. The rift itself, not the river, but the rift itself goes all the way down here to the Gulf of Aqaba and feeds on into the Red Sea as far as the rift itself. There's 3 spring-fed rivulets, as I mentioned, up around Mount Hermon, flows down to Hula Lake, which is really a swamp, and then it drops, as I said, about 900 feet, and then empties into the Sea of Galilee. This is an inland freshwater lake. It's nearly 700 feet below sea level. Now, it itself is below sea level, and it's surrounded by some rounded hills. The lake itself, it's about 7 miles wide, and it's about 13 miles long. Now, there's something unique about that lake being the freshwater lake that it is. and then flowing on down from there to becoming the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea has no natural outlet. As the water flows from the mountains, feeds into this little marshy area of Hula, feeds on down into the Sea of Galilee, and then comes on down and rushes on down in some ways with the decline, descending rather from its heights, down to the Dead Sea. And it concludes here, this is the lowest freshwater lake. This is the lowest place on earth. And it's called the Dead Sea for an obvious reason. Salt content. It's very mineral rich. Anyone have any idea what the salt content is of the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean? Pause. Momentary opportunity. Anyone? Come on. It's not been that long since you were in science class, not that long since you've been aware of it. You want to take a guess? 0.5%. Yeah, a little more than that. Yeah, but thank you for contributing. You get a gold star for today. I appreciate you doing that. No, it's a little bit more. Anywhere from like, anyone else want to take a chance? Obviously, it's more than 3. I'm sorry, I just gave you the answer, sorry. It's more than 0.5, and it's between 5 and 0.5. What'd you say, Eva? It's 3. It's 3.3 to 3.7, okay? Now, have you ever been in the water and you take out it in your mouth, it's kind of salty kind of thing? If you're in the Dead Sea, you would really think it's salty. You want to take a guess now how much saltier the Dead Sea is compared to the Atlantic? Now remember, the Atlantic's 3.3 to 3.7, salty content. There you go, exactly, 10 times more. It's 30% content, salt. That's really salt. You definitely get to go, okay, she's back there going like that. Yeah. She's one of those. I got you. I know what students you are now. So those limestone cliffs, as I mentioned, of course, with that salt content along the way, it makes a unique kind of place. The limestone cliffs that are hidden in there, obviously it makes that water to be something you could float in. For those of you who have never had the opportunity to, or couldn't really float, there's some people that can't lay in the water and really float because you want to flounder around. Wouldn't be a problem in the Dead Sea. Just jump in there and just lay back and you can float all day long because that salt content is going to make a difference for you. Like I said, hideaway for bandits and political figures. There's something also interesting about those caves. You want to take a guess? The caves on the northwestern side, the caves of the Dead Sea, there's the hint. The caves of the Dead Sea, yeah, they held bandits and they held political figures and they had held people that just, needing a place to hide out. But what else do you think might have been in those caves of the Dead Sea? Yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's where they were found, just about a mile north of this point right here, on the northwestern area of the Dead Sea, along in those caves. Some shepherds in 1946, 1947 time found some jars, and in those jars what was discovered were now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's go back and take a look up the Jordan River. Hula. Take a look at Hula, which is right there. Hula is, as I said, it's a large swampy area, but it's mostly been drained. In the 20th century, it was drained as Israel began to become a nation. They drained that area so it can become good for agricultural purposes. And so it's really a swampy, marshy area. The Sea of Galilee was also known as Lake Knesset, and the Sea of Galilee is, as I said, about 700 feet below sea level, and it enters into, from Hula, enters in from the north, and it deposits at Silt, and then it goes on out on its southern end to continue on to the flow. I'll tell in a minute because I'll spend more time specifically with the Jordan River, but this is sort of the beginnings of the introduction of the highlights of it. And then, of course, the final destination of the Jordan River is the Dead Sea. And as I said, it's the lowest point on earth. Now, to the right, the last area that I've not really discussed, but I want to talk about now is known as the Transjordan. You may have remembered seeing that maybe in one of the readings of the Bible, but the Transjordan, this eastern plateau. Very unique thing about it is, once again, to show you the picture of it, that is the Transjordan. When I mentioned that it's like the backbone, envision, and I tried to look at this, tried to zoom in and figure out what exactly is right here, but I believe that right here is a small building, and that's a car. Just to give you an idea of the height. This is another building over here. But to give you an idea of one of those little white spots you see there being a car, look at the height. Because we could talk about how that this plateau rises up to 6,000 feet in some places. So you've got these mountains along this side, and that's the western side, the eastern side of the Jordan River. But notice how high it rises up. And the same thing then coming down from the hills that are on the western side. So this is the Jordan River and the Transjordan. And so when we go back and we look at this area of the Transjordan run along here, there's a little spot right through here that's not quite so much the flat top, or it's more flattened out rather, it's not as high. But this is a plateau. There's a couple pictures I didn't put in here where you literally could see where there's the Jordan River and then there's a table up at the top. It's flattened. It's as if you just could come to the edge of this table and then it just drops off 4,000 or 5,000 feet down to the Jordan River. And this is the Transjordan. Well, this is what was also called, you may remember the wordings of the King's Highway. And this is the King's Highway that runs along here. Once again, remembering that as Dan has showed us, when you leave out from Ur of the Chaldees and come up the Euphrates River, go up here to Haran, and then circle back around as Abraham did. Well, that is the King's Highway. And it runs right through here, the story, the mountains of Moab. You may remember when the Israelites were leaving Egypt, and as they had journeyed from the Sinai, and Jacob was bringing them, and they were to come up and wanted to enter into the land, the Moabites said no. Well, what were they traveling? They were traveling along the King's Highway, coming up from down here in the Negev, coming up along the King's Highway to come over to enter north of the Dead Sea to want to come in. And that's why Mount Nebo is where Moses was when he got a chance to look over and see into the land of Canaan, because that's where they had reached coming up. So the people of Moab were not really being nice, and eventually God, as he did with all of those who were not being nice to his children, he did find a way to let them be aware that he is God. He is the one true God. So this is a region that has a lot of the Bible peoples. You may have heard the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the area of Gilead, and Bashan. It's the Transjordan Mountains. It rises, like I said, from 2,000 to 6,000 feet right along the edge. Just very quickly starts rising from 2,000 to 6,000 feet in height and above sea level. This is served by 4 major wadis, 4 major rivers that come through. They're seasonal, and they feed the Jordan River running through this plateau. It's the first area that the Hebrews settled as part of their conquest after the Exodus from Egypt, and that's where you would read in Joshua chapter 13. And so throughout the history of the Old Testament, this plateau area was often the site of military conquest and military battles that occurred right along on this edge before you got into the Arabian desert. So there are some rivers and some nice areas through there. But this is where the Hebrews, the Armenians, the Assyrians, the Moabites, the Ammonites, they all vied for control of this trade route along what is known as the King's Highway. So there was constant in and out battles as to who could control this area. Because for one, as people would come through, they would exact taxes. They would exact from them rites of passage. You owe us for coming through this area. If not, we will attack you. Go back to slide number 1, and the last area that I want to discuss, which I've not really, I am there. Last area is this area down here, the area of the Negev. It's south of Judea, and it's a desert region, and it receives less rainfall. It's the area that gets the least amount of rainfall, but as you begin to move up, you get more rainfall through here, up into the valley, and up into the Galilean hills. Its name actually means the dry land. Speaking of rainfall, let's talk a little bit about the seasonal changes that occur. There's a big influence. It's this big body of water right there. And it's a big influence, it's this big body of heat. If you're familiar with the storms that rise up over Texas as the waters from the Pacific, as they come up from the Gulf and move through Texas and get over that hot land, that's what creates that boiling effect and the tornadoes that occur through Tornado Alley of Oklahoma and Arkansas and Missouri and Kansas moving on up because of that interaction of the heat and the moisture. Well, the same kind of occurrence here, but not so much the tornadoes I'm meaning, but the same kind of influence that's going on with the moist winds of the Mediterranean that are meeting the heat coming off of the plains that are over here in the Transjordan. So what they have is a winter rainy season from October to April. And I found this that I thought would be of interest to look at, and that is the Jewish calendar. In particular, if you notice, look at the wet season. The wet season begins right here. Here's the months, starting October, about right now, and running through what we would call our winter time through about March. So this is the wet season. And you can see the types of things that are occurring. I thought it was interesting that, you see here the grain is beginning to be planted through the wet season, mild winters, the cereals begin to grow, and then you can see the harvest that occur as you move on into this time and to get into the dry season. So essentially you can say from September to March, that's the wet, and from April begins to dry out, get into what would be, well, similar to us. Same thing, the hot time that we call the summer is about the same for them. The cool seasons that they have are same with us, but it's their wet season versus the dry season. And I found that to be interesting. So look, hot summers, mild winters. Along the way, you can see the different types of celebrations that are occurring. Here's September, coming up on Tuesday. Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, September. The fruits harvest occurs in this time. Over here, the Passover, March and April. So the crops. It's a land flowing with milk and honey, so you can think of it as having a lot of pastures and agriculture. The staple crops would be wheat and barley and grapes and olives. And they use the olives and the grapes in making the wine and the oil. There's something unique about that, is that Jordan Rift that you see, there is a fault line. There's a major fault line that runs through there, and it's caused frequent earthquakes, and it's contributed to what is that unique formation of that Jordan Rift. So we have a mild winter when most of the rain is falling, and a very hot summer. In the summer, usually, I noted that it's usually too hot to be standing around, so of course palm trees and fig trees are welcome shade that they would be looking for. The Jordan River. Let's move specifically to it. Here's the Jordan River, and once again, now looking at it as a cross-section, you can see here's the Mediterranean, there's sea level running right there. And you can see down here with the coastal plain, and then we begin to do the rise up to Jerusalem, and then come down into the valley, and down into the valley, and down into the valley, and into the valley, and back up on the other side to here's Mount Nebo on the eastern plateau. So there's the four areas running north and south: the coastal plain, the central highlands, the Jordan Valley, and the eastern plateau. It's the lowest point on land. It's a hypersaline lake. It's the saltiest body, as I said, about 10 times salter. It makes it so dense it's easily to float onto the surface, but it does provide for a lot of minerals. Now, I'm not good with the meters, so I'm going to change what you see up here. This 744 meters that you see for the height of Jerusalem, to being above sea level, that's about 2,400 feet above sea level. The Dead Sea itself is sitting about 1,400 feet below sea level. So here you are with the Jerusalem, and you can see why when we talk about going up to Jerusalem, you're going up the ridge to the Jerusalem, and then you begin to come down into the valley. Well, there's sea level. Well, Jerusalem, now the sea level, but the level of the beginning of the lake itself, 423 meters below the surface, that is going to put you 1,388, almost 1,400 feet below level. Now the waters of the Dead Sea, well, they're deep too, because the sea itself falls down about 1,300 feet deep. To give you an idea, you've probably seen this building. It's called the Empire State Building. It's kind of tall. At one time it was the tallest building in the world. You take that wonderful, tall building, and remember I told you this is deep? You could take that building and you could move it right down in there, and it would be sitting with about 13 feet of the spire sticking out. So you'd look in the middle of the lake and you'd see this about 13 feet. Oh, look, there's a flagpole out there. No, that's the top of the Empire State Building. So the bottom of the sea lies 2,600 feet below sea level. So to give you an idea again, just how tall is that, and I don't know what that did there. Once again, you're familiar with this one? And I got to remember how to say that. The Burj Khalifa in Dubai, it's the tallest building in the world. It stands at 5,065 feet tall. To give you an idea just how deep this is from the bottom of the Dead Sea to rise up past sea level, to get up here to be equal with the top of these mountains. And remember, I told you that some of these are like 6,000 feet tall here. If you were to take the Burj Khalifa and put it sitting on the bottom of the Dead Sea, well, you could put one of them there and it would rise out of the sea, but you would stack another one of those and it would be sitting about 400 feet above this level of Jerusalem. That's a big drop from the height of Jerusalem down into the valley, down past sea level, to go all the way down to the Dead Sea itself, and then in the Dead Sea, the depths of the Dead Sea itself. Mountains. Let's take a look at the mountains. Got about 18 minutes left. The biblical lens of the mountains. Mount Carmel. Now the one that I don't have on this map is Mount Hermon, right up around here. That's what feeds the waters that lead down, well actually it's going to be more like up here. Mount Hermon that feeds down into Hula and comes down to Sea of Galilee to then come on down through the Jordan River and feeds down into the Dead Sea. Mount Carmel, Mount Tabor, Gilboa, Ebal, and Garrison. Mount Nebo on the eastern side of in the Transjordan, on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And then right around this area of Jerusalem, the Mount of Olives, Mount Moriah, Mount Ophel, and Mount Zion. So let's start with Mount Hermon. That's the snow-capped mountain right up in here. It is as tall as the Rockies, 9,053 feet. It's in what is the ancient lands of Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. It's the northern border of what was the Promised Land. It's repeatedly mentioned throughout the Old Testament. Now, traditionally, well, a possible stated idea of where the transformation could have occurred is because it's close to the Sea of Galilee and Jesus spent a lot of time that's here, it is considered one of those possible, rather than Mount Tabor, with Mount Tabor being right here, also around the Sea of Galilee, as the site of the Jesus' transfiguration. If you were to read in the Bible, especially like in Psalms 133, Mount Hermon is one that's mentioned poetically, sort of showing the blessing of God's unity with his people, and the way that the dew of the mountain is refreshing the land, just as God is refreshing his people in Psalms 133. So the mention of Mount Hermon. Another mountain is Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel sits right here at this little jagged area sitting out, and this is the Jezreel Valley. You can see the Kishon River that runs through the valley. And this is Mount Carmel. You might remember some incident that occurred there. It's known for overlooking the Jezreel Valley, but it's famous for what event? Okay, this is the time for you to be speaking. I know you can think of it. You remember a great big event that occurred in the Old Testament on Mount Carmel. Prophets of Baal. There was a little contest that occurred there. And this is where the 450 prophets of Baal and Elijah challenged them, and with God's help showing him, well, God doing it all, but Baal was being worshipped in the 450 on that mountain. So Elijah said, come to this mountain and I challenge you. And of course, you know, in 1 Kings 18, you know that outcome. And I think it's such a wonderful story the kids can be hearing. I've always thought it was amazing that the water was lapped up. Okay, heat, but so were the rocks. So was everything around it. It wasn't that God just caused that sacrifice to be destroyed. He just had everything to be destroyed. You can also see that Mount Carmel is mentioned throughout other areas in Psalms and Jeremiah, talking about the majesty and the splendor of Mount Carmel, its beauty and its strength. But Mount Carmel. Two other mountains that sit right here across from each other, part of this valley, down at the very end. The city of Shechem sat right in the middle between them. But there was another Old Testament event that occurred with Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. Anyone recall that event? Joshua and the people of Israel. These are two mountains that stand opposite each other, and it was called the ceremony of blessings and curses. Does that give you a hint, remembering the story? People of Israel separated. Half of the tribes went over on one mountain, The other half of the tribes went over on the other mountain. And it was there that they heard the blessings of obedience to God's laws. And the other half heard on Mount Ebal, that was Mount Gerizim, where they heard the blessings. And Mount Ebal is where they heard the curses for disobedience. You can find that story in Deuteronomy 27 as well as in Joshua 8. And then one last reference to this particular area, in particular Mount Gerizim, right here. You remember where I told you that this is broken into three areas? This is the Galilean area, this is the Samaritan area, and this is the Judea area. Mount Gerizim, it's a story in the New Testament. Do you remember the story of what occurred there? And just here's the hint. Mount Gerizim is in Samaria. Remember an event talking about this mountain? The woman at the well. The Lord is speaking with her and she says, Lord, our fathers, our people have worship here on this mountain. That's where we worship. And Jesus tells her there is coming a time when if you knew the living water that I would ask for, that you would not need a mountain. Because she was saying, our people, the ones that separated out in Samaria, they put a temple here in Jerusalem. But you, the Jews, say that you have to go to the mount on Jerusalem. And so that was that mountain of Jerusalem that you found in John chapter 4. Moving on down, Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. That's rising. Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you that Mount Ebal is 3,000 feet and Gerizim is about 2,800 feet. Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount, both found right here. About 2,400 feet. That's a ridge in Jerusalem. It includes what's known as the Temple Mount, the site of the Jewish temples. And this is the traditional site where God had commanded Abraham to take Isaac and sacrifice him. When they traveled for days, they traveled up the mountain, and traditionally it is right here in the area of Jerusalem on what is the Temple Mount, or Mount Moriah. It's also where Solomon's temple was built. King David purchased the threshing floor on Mount Moriah, and his son Solomon later built the first temple on that very same spot. Another one is Mount Zion. Mount Zion, originally the name referred with King David. Mount Zion essentially is that poetic and spiritual name for the entire city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem encompasses Ophel, or Ophel, as well as olives off to the side. Mount Zion is not really specifically a mountain as much as it is an area, as same as with Ophel. They're all encompassing this Jerusalem mountain area. And so you have all these ridges, these mountains. And I did not get the height of that one. I forgot with what the height of Mount Zion is. But to give you an idea of the Mount of Olives, that ridge which is across from the Kidron Valley, which is right here, this is Mount Olives. That's about 2,600 feet. They're all around the same height. But the city of David was renamed the city of David after being conquered from the Jebusites. David made it his capital. And this area, Mount Zion, as you know, we're marching to Zion. It became to symbolize God's holy dwelling place here on earth. And it was the spiritual center for his people. This area of Mount Zion and all of these other areas. And of course, you know what occurred in the Mount of Olives as Jesus would go there to pray. And as he was arrested, as he was in the Mount of Olives, but he would go and look over the city. And so as it talks about how that he looks down and talks about Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I weep for you I would pull you in under my wings. He's sitting and watching the city because he's in a risen area, the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives, about 2,600 feet. It's across from the Kidron Valley. It's a frequent place of retreat and prayer for the Lord. It's where you find the Garden of Gethsemane. The Ascension occurred there in the Mount of Olives. Another mountain, which is not on this map, but you know it, Mount Sinai, which is somewhere down here in the Sinai Peninsula. That rises to a height of 6,780 feet. The exact location is debated, but it's in the desert mountains where Jesus received the Ten Commandments and the covenant of the law, as we read in Jerusalem. And it served as a central point for God's revelation and a covenant that he had with his Israelite people as they were having the exodus from Egypt. Mount Ophel. Mount Ophel right here. It's one that you can find in the Old Testament in like Nehemiah, in Chronicles, chapters like 22nd Chronicles, in the rebuilding of the temple. And it mentioned several times, just in passing, that they were rebuilding the walls. They were building walls on Ophel. And so the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem in the Old Testament. And it was also mentioned in Isaiah 32 as being the watchtower there on the Temple Mount, that area of Mount Ophel. And it stands about 2,000 feet. Well, we started out with Mount Nebo, saying that this is where Moses was able to stand and look all the way up from Dan down to Beersheba. It's only about 70 miles wide, about 160 miles total. It's about the equivalent of West Palm Beach to Orlando, West Palm Beach over to Clewiston. It's not big. And so from Mount Nebo, the Lord looks and says, take a look across the valley, see the land, and this is the land of promise. And it's in Mount Nebo, which rises to 2,685 feet, situated on the Transjordan, which is now modern-day Jordan. It's Moses' last view. It's where he viewed the promised land before he died, having been told by God that he would not enter it himself in the reading of Deuteronomy 34. And with that, I did finish all the notes that I had with about 4 minutes to spare. Now, that was 3 weeks worth of lessons broken down in the junior high class that I put together. But again, Dan asked me not to specifically try to teach from the biblical wanderings and to relate, but to talk about some of the facts. Maybe some of the things you didn't know. For me, I remember being amazed that there was snow on top of mountains. Growing up in Florida, of course, I was amazed anything about snow. But snow, snow that could be on top of these mountains. A little too hot to be on top of, but even on the Sinai mountain, there was snow that was on there. But even some of these mountains that you're seeing through here, there could be snow at certain times of the year. To know that there was snow, to know that there's that amount of rain that does fall, specifically right in through this area and along this Kishon River in this Jezreel Valley. And to understand the height of this, that backbone, again, that backbone picture that I showed you of the ridge, of just exactly how high all of this area of mountains is, and all of this area of mountains, but yet how deep this runs. To go back and take a look at how deep it runs. But a good picture to show how high it rises, and how deep it falls. And then go back and show one more time the backbone. So that's the land of Israel. And this is about where Moses was standing to look north and to look south. I trust that you found something that you could use, something to enjoy, at least something to be alerted to the uniqueness of the stories of the Bible and the region that we now know about as the land of Israel. And I trust that you can enjoy using that. Thank you very much. We'll finish up.